Hello and welcome to the PE Insights podcast, conversations about physical education with me, Nathan Walker. Thank you for joining me. You're very, very welcome. I hope you enjoyed today's episode as we delve into another insight around physical education. Hello everyone and welcome back to the PE Insights podcast. Thank you for your continued support. As always, your feedback is welcome. And I would love to hear from you, good and bad. You know, I'm always open to different perspectives and directions for the podcast. So thank you for your engagement, but always welcome to hear more. And of course, if you'd love to come on the podcast, don't forget to reach out. You'll also notice that we ventured into the world of podcasts. The YouTube channel will be, it's another development project for me. There are 2 episodes on there that you might like to go and watch when you have a second. Again, feedback gratefully welcome. Today's conversation is a conversation with Tom Bell. So myself and Tom know each other from our time in Doha, where we worked as PE teachers in Qatar. Tom moved from Doha to go and work in Bangkok, and he's returned to the UK, where he's since become a director of sport at a very successful independent school in the southwest. Tom is passionate about developing teachers, is an inspirational leader, and has an interest in enabling teachers to challenge the status quo, to get them to go above and beyond every single day. So I hope you enjoy today's conversation and sit back and enjoy. Tom, welcome to the PE Insights podcast.
Hi Nathan, how are you?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Thank you for taking the time to jump on this morning. How are you?
I'm very well. It's a bit cold, wet and windy here, but I'm very happy to be, getting involved in these conversations, and I've loved listening to the others so far on this journey as well.
Thanks, Tom. That means a lot, mate. And obviously, it's very cold and wet and windy compared to what we were used to in the glory days in Doha.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, very fond memories. Our time goes back quite a while now. But 40-degree temperature is a thing of the past, unfortunately.
Right. So tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your journey so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably the most thought-provoking question that is asked of all of your sort of, your podcast people. And I think, I've tried to take a different spin on it, having listened to others and sort of the questions they've asked, it made me really think about my own origins of, actually what education is for me. And, this is not exclusively formalized in a linear pathway for me. My family, I guess, is that first part of that educational journey. I've gone through school, obviously, and college and university and so on. But I think, for me, it started with a large supportive family network. I've been very fortunate to grow up with 2, amazing parents who have bent over backwards to support me emotionally and financially, and, actually still do, even though, my own family is growing. Grandparents and cousins who, who have ferried me around and rushed me around to those things. And that is the sort of, I guess, the first part of my educational journey in terms of value of, family and respect and sort of those unconscious behaviors of what I actually want from other people.
Yeah.
It would be fair to say at school I was a pretty beige student, and I mean this in the sense of, I attended a state school. I was that student who never got a detention, no academic concerns, but equally I never sort of tipped the balance in being someone who was high flying.
Right.
I guess the type of student who would go under the radar. I loved PE. I loved competition. I loved just that, perhaps probably more the social aspect of PE than maybe the academic side of it. And it was a chance for me to sort of expel some of that sort of built up energy. Like yourself, Nathan, I would arrive to school early just to play football. My break times, lunch times consumed with, football, scoffing down perhaps a peanut butter sandwich on white bread that, I sort of reluctantly made in the morning, and my lunch times were filled with indoor cricket and table tennis. I was really exposed, I would say, to perhaps an unconscious amount of physical education, and that was at school. before coming home with my dad, ferrying me everywhere I wanted to go for football training and cricket clubs and so on.
Yeah.
Fast forwards, I did GCSE PE. I've heard a few others say they did drama, which I'm not even sure if drama was an option at my school. But I was definitely a PE GCSE student.
Yeah.
But, unlike, sort of my older brother, my GCSE results probably left a lot to be desired for, I would say. I didn't get the grades I wanted, and this was, led me down a particular pathway where, I was actually, for the first time in my life, probably somewhat disgruntled, but deserved, the grades of what come my way. I went on to study sports science at college. Like I said, this wasn't my first choice. I was thinking about an A-level route, but took a BTEC path instead. And actually, I guess this is the first point, I come across an educational role model who really was, quite brilliant and passionate and equally competitive in personality. And I guess just grabbed me by the scruff of my neck and, built up an element of resilience and determination for me. She probably doesn't even know the impact she's had on me, I guess for a young man to be so influenced by a female lecturer at that point in time was quite a strange, if not sort of out of the norm, in terms of setting someone up. I went on, I guess to get, sports science student of the year and overall sportsman of the year, which set me up nicely for university. And my parents would also agree that was the sort of the first time in my life where actually I've taken responsibility for my actions and,
Right.
I achieved something.
Amazing.
Gone to university. The London Lights have drew me in. I had the most amazing 3 years studying sports science at degree level. I met individuals who become wedding guests, lifelong friends, and, essentially become, family. I love playing football for the university football team. Football tours and the culture of banter was obviously something very new to me then. And, obviously I loved the sports science laboratory aspect of the course. Me and my housemates, all studied sports science. We went on to work at Wimbledon as court coverers, and then we flew to New York to be football coaches. We were a compact, tight unit of individuals who loved sport, loved learning, and that became the sort of the route for me and why I wanted to go on and think, I would love to be a PE teacher, to be exposed to this environment my whole life. I then went and studied a PGCE at London Metropolitan and North London. I had quite the exceptional cohort, I would say, really competitive individuals and really a really thought-provoking course leader, Greg Dreyer, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, and anyone in the PE circuit, and really set the tone for, I guess, my educational understanding and the ability to question my thinking. I think fondly in a strange way.
He does that well, doesn't he? Sorry to butt in, but Greg does that really, really well, doesn't he, in terms of questioning your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think of this one time, and I'm sure that I've spoken to him on many occasions, and we've had a bit of a laugh about this. But at one time, I thought, I've nailed this as a PE teacher. I understand what I'm doing. My placement school was in Tooting in South London, and I was delivering a basketball unit of work, and I think it was on like week 3, and Greg was, due to see me. I delivered that typical lesson where everyone was in a straight line, and we did chest pass, and we did a bounce pass, and then we did a javelin pass. He really tore a strip out of me. And, to the point where I was sort of like, I thought I was the bee's knees at that point. But it was done in such a way where it really made me think about my actions and actually what a PE lesson would be. Me and Greg actually, team taught that lesson. And while reluctantly I had to get a tube back to North London with him on it, in silence, may I add, again, it's those moments that really set the tone for actually what learning environments should be, and that unconscious sort of desire to want a little bit more. You
Yeah.
know, and ever since, you know, I keep in touch with those people on my course, you know, and Greg, you know, we've, especially during lockdown and COVID, you know, we're on different sides of the world, and we spent many of the time talking about PE and school and sport and stuff like that. And I guess that's been a real sort of game changer for me. So they're two sort of standout individuals who've really shaped, you know, sort of my passion for sport. You know, I've since been a PE teacher, head of PE. Obviously, what have you, Nathan, in Qatar? You know, and you know, I've been a director of sport now, in, you know, 4 different schools. You know, moving to Qatar to another world-class school in Bangkok before, you know, finally heading home after 9 brilliant international years away
Yeah.
last year. You know, PE is important to me. You know, for me, it has changed over time. You know, but I'd like to think I stay passionate for PE and its value, and you know, I like to stay connected to those, you know, individuals who are like-minded like me, I guess.
Brilliant. So tell us a little bit about your role now. Obviously, you've moved recently. So what are you currently doing in your?
I'm director of sport in a brilliant independent school in the southwest. You know, very forward-thinking leadership team. You know, I've got what I would say is full autonomy to change things up, to really leave my mark and, you know, add a stamp of what I identify as physical education is. You know, while my title says director of sport, I oversee you know, PE across the whole school, and you know, and that's a really chance for me to sort of, you know, look back on what I've done previously and sort of add some value somewhere else.
Brilliant. So you talked about your vision for PE. That would you like to share that then? So what is your vision, and how are you applying that to your department or people you work with?
Yeah, I guess my vision, you know, I'll talk a little bit about this more in a minute, but, you know, through the lens of my own children, I guess has sort of shaped this vision. You know, schools have become more competitive and perhaps even more business related in terms of how they would sort of recruit students, or the things they celebrate, especially since social media. You know, for me, P still remains that one subject area where one size doesn't fit all. You know, we have to be reactive in terms of adapting and modifying and adjusting our provision constantly to, you know, the children and the context that we're in. You know, having worked across, you know, across the world, you know, no class has ever been the same. I've never been in a position where I can just pick something up and just drop it, and you know, it works magically. This lesson is exactly the same. You know, it's about understanding that. So I guess my vision is ensuring that PE still remains that subject that, you know, it's the itch that doesn't go away. You want to come back for more. You know, you're developing the softer skills as well as sort of that core understanding of why movement is important, you know, in your life. We talk about this sort of lifelong learning and a lifelong participation in sport and PE. And I guess, you know, that rings true. You know, if I think about my own context, the influences that perhaps, you know, from a family side of things, as well as sort of the sort of 2 influential role models in sort of my education, that is the legacy of what we're trying to do here. You know, and I think while the term legacy is quite a broad term, actually, what we're trying to do is create memories, positive memories that encourage individuals, young people, to stay physically active their whole lives.
So in your school, Tommy, do you have, because you're in a independent school, is sport separate from physical education? And if so, how does PE look different from the sport provision in your school, in your setting?
I guess, you know, sport and PE, you know, for some people is, you know, and I'll talk a bit about it in a minute. I think you know, there's a huge debate, and you don't have to go far. Had you asked me this question a year ago about like why PE is important and so on, I would have probably given you a different answer. This is for me an evolving question, and I guess my understanding, perception, and situation changes obviously change my answer. And I think that is the unique thing about this question, is we all have a different view and an understanding of why it's important to us and for individuals, why PE and sport is different in different contexts, because actually there isn't a definitive answer. If I was to go just 15 minutes up the road in a different school, that answer would be different to my own setting. And I think until you appreciate that sort of, as sports people, as PE teachers, we're competitive in nature. Yet, actually, what we do need to understand is actually it's different, and we have to accept that. So, working in different environments and schools changes this landscape. I've been very fortunate to being, undoubtedly, like yourself, Nathan, a product of a successful PE experience filled with opportunities, positive role models, memories, and littered with things that actually you can recall now, even today, from your own schooling. We can get caught up in the language as PE professionals endlessly on, Twitter or X as it's known today, where people are talking about, oh, hold on, that's physical activity, or that's sport, that's games, that's not PE. I see it non-stop. And for me, it's that sort of like one bugbear where, sometimes I've commented on things and had a bit of a reaction, and other times I sort of sat back and just seeing how things unfold. But, I've worked with, a couple of very diligent heads of PE, and we've had heated debates about PE and games. We spend most of our time, I would say, losing touch with what the difference is between PE and sport is, in an attempt to separate these for our own personal sort of issues and agendas. I've had, my last head of PE, our meetings we took outside of an office space and spent walking around a sports field. This was sort of like our open space to have conversations, but, our professional titles, essentially would clash. Hers, the remit, was head of PE, and mine, a more outward facing sort of part of the school life, as director of sport. But our intentions remain the same. Actually, what is the best offering for students that we can give for them to be physically active, learn and develop? Because that is the core of what we're trying to achieve here. I am a PE teacher. I always will be a PE teacher, and for me to detail how I understand its importance and its focus is about, leaving that positive message and the experience about movement, physical development, and actually understanding that they're the sort of paramount sort of, non-negotiables, if you like. And I guess it comes down to that, how are we measuring these things? If you're going to use statistics to talk about your sports teams in terms of how much distance they've covered, okay, brilliant. But unless that actually really adds value to, your comparisons to that, unless you're picking up that data and looking at it against other schools from a sport perspective, for me, that value is that sort of data is irrelevant. And equally from a PE perspective, and I'm talking about PE and sport being something that I accept as, they go hand in hand rather than a sort of separation of these two things. And from a PE side of things, it's about, making sure that what you're actually doing has an impact. And this is conscious decisions and success, and how you are measuring it, whether that be consciously or unconsciously. And the context is key there.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you shared that, because, I was just thinking in terms of like, maybe we get caught up in semantics. They are different words, they mean different things, but they do actually go hand in hand. It's all about what our intention is, and if our intention is similar, can they work together? I know some schools, I've been to some schools where they're two very different things. There are games lessons and PE lessons, and they have different targets and objectives, but does that mean that they are under two separate umbrellas, or are they working hand in hand? So it's just an interesting thing to discuss, particularly from maybe an independent school setting where traditionally, or maybe not traditionally, but it might have had a certain sort of message or identity before. But it's pleasing to see someone who is putting sport and PE together because the intention or the objective is the same in terms of physical activity in relationship with movement. So what
Mm.
I know we've talked about this quite a lot in terms of what you're passionate about as a leader, and it's an opportunity for you now to share those thoughts with the listener, Tom.
Yeah, I think I go back to sort of when we're talking about that sort of measuring that data. If you look at that YouTube video, and there's a Simon Sinek one, and he debates the purpose, and he makes reference to being in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, on day one, you go to the gym and you take your top off and you look in the mirror when you get home, and there is no change. Day two, you do the same thing. Day three, but actually, at some point, there will be progress made over time. But it's actually really hard to pinpoint at what point that actually happens. You have to trust the process. Essentially, I make this, statement in the result of change. If, as educators, we really want to address the importance of being physically educated, and we want to develop our social, emotional, cognitive, and physical understanding, we must continue to look for evidence and keep asking those change and asking about where that change is actually happening, pinpoint that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, I'm very fortunate to be working with an ECT this year. It's something that I've sort of put my hand up for. I'm looking forward to doing, and the chance really to shape sort of the educational journey of a PE practitioner in much of the same way that others have had, a positive influence on me.
Mm-hmm.
And our recent conversation has always sort of stemmed around this sort of one question, and it's, how does your PE offer differ from others? Now, this is a rhetorical question, and it's used to shape sort of additional thought process about, what she does, how she does it, and the impact that, she's created in her lessons. I must stress, this is not about doing something different per se, but thinking about the steps taken to ensure there's that value added.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we stem it back a little bit, PE has changed. Many countries around the world, we know that PE is, explicitly and directly responsible for, education of health and, for young people. PE teachers are now responsible for the holistic development of students, like I said, physical, social, emotional, and even the mental well-being now. And I guess for me, it's in this definition that's somewhat generalized, and the research shows us that actually in schools across the world, PE is largely taught the same way. Now, that might spark some debate with, a couple of individuals who say, hold on, I don't do this in that way, but I'm talking about a generalized lens. PE in every context, perhaps you've even been in, Nathan, have you delivered your lessons differently to the classes that you've taught, or actually as a whole, from a distance or as in a gaze, that PE actually is the same. So it's the same with a twist or a difference. We change that and we bend the things in terms of the culture and the context that we're working in. So when I talk about sort of challenging the status quo, I'm not talking about, putting people's nose out of joint, trying to prove a point, trying to be, sort of an arrogant level to wanting to come in to a new school and change things. And I guess over my educational journey, I've sort of learned that sort of, when I've gone to new schools, the first thing you want to do is wipe out the existing member of staff sort of, not necessarily credibility, but in terms of you're looking to change things, you're almost getting an upper hand. And that is, I guess, a very sort of human nature response to, change and adaptation and modification.
Yeah.
But I guess it's not until you sort of really value the steps of, your predecessor and where you've worked. But actually, we're all on the same game. We all want the same thing. We're all chasing performance. We're all chasing better results. We're all chasing better experiences for students. And I guess when we're talking about challenging the status quo, we've really got to think about our own context. And, and that for me remains the key to this sort of conversation. The context is key. Educational practice is different everywhere. We spent a large amount of time looking for the perfect answers, especially at an ECT level. You seem to think, you've got a basketball block of work coming up, for instance, and, the first thing that probably many of your students, Nathan, might even do is go online and look for the sort of the perfect lesson plan, or look for the perfect drills or skills in order to teach, as if that model or that perfect lesson is a masterstroke or educational brilliance would just be there to download. You know, it doesn't
Yeah.
exist. But the conversations that you can have with experienced members of staff, or in fact you can find online, will add that element of development. So when we're talking about changing things, it's about picking up something. It's about adding your own personal spin and sort of keeping that sort of sphere moving, if you like, in terms of the intention to make things a more meaningful experience. And therefore, changing the curriculum, increase engagement, and enhance the learning of, whether that be, the similar things. Yes, we all have curriculums, timings, and class splits, whatever. But what I'm talking about is the ability to drive on the next wave. For me, again, student voice is a crucial aspect of that. Had I had asked questions I'm asking now of cohorts that perhaps, we had in Qatar, perhaps I would have created a more positive and more meaningful learning experience. Is that the type of information that I can now pass on to, newly qualified teachers or, even my own ECT? Of course it is. And if you examine, sort of the self-determination theory, we are talking about learning experiences and well-being in PE. We're talking about actually looking at satisfying those sort of innate psychological needs of, what are your feelings? How does this relate to you? What is your competence and autonomy to have a voice in the change of that? So I guess, it goes back to that sense of belonging. What is it that you really want to achieve in your PE context? How does that have any value or meaning to it? What is the sort of the rationale for your environment? Is it you want a high performing, positive classroom environment that's highly functioning? Or is it actually, you want every single student in your class to have improved educational outcomes, and therefore, as a result, you've got positive psychological, well-being and mentality installed. So I guess, I quite like a sort of a blog, but it's that fear for change, and I would encourage educators to really challenge that sort of status quo. Many PE programs in schools that I've certainly worked in, there's a large amount of, body of staff that have stayed in the same place for a huge amount of time, and things have changed, become unchanged or untapped, if you like. Now, I guess you have to argue, is this because the personnel has stayed the same way, or, within the same job, or is this simply there hasn't been enough time for reflection, or, have they found the perfect model and, this is done and dusted? I very doubt it's the last one. But I guess, that sort of takeaway from COVID at that time, and this is a rare thing to say about positivity at COVID. But, as physical educators across the globe, all of a sudden forums and groups and chats were something that PE teachers were heavily engaged in. How often can you actually say now as a PE teacher that you go, oh, I've just connected with someone across the other side of the world and we talked about our lessons and we talked about what we're doing in order to get students back on track. That moment has gone, and in a very sad way, we've sort of, reverted back to, the same process and the same model that we were at, and we've accepted the norm again.
Yeah.
So, going back, knowing your setting, getting a real deep dive into the feedback will lead to change in your settings. If you were to remove a whole PE department in any school, delete all the files and the paperwork and carry on, and then bring in a whole new team of people, the PE focus and the PE lessons would be completely different. So one size doesn't fit all, and therefore, having that ability to change and challenge, I think is a really crucial part that, as educators, we should be asking of, our student body, but also of our staff body as well. And I guess my message there is, don't upset the apple cart, destroy relationships and traditions within your context, obviously, in an attempt to, to prove a point or make a mark, but certainly learn from that, ask questions and, make decisions based on data, challenge the norms, but do it in such a context that you can only add professional value to that. I was listening to sort of the high performance podcast, and they talked about a Xander letter. Well, I've never heard of this before. And it was in an approach where, you write a letter that you don't open again, in another 12 months time, that says, what does your year look like? Those are the type of things from a PE context, and especially sort of my ECT, I'll be asking that question of, write down what 12 months looks like for you in terms of PE professionalism, and then we'll look back and see, how we've achieved those steps. And that's sort of my main takeaways for you, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I've got two things that kind of spring to mind there. Firstly, do you think it's because it's the old sort of saying or the adage of if it ain't broke, it doesn't need fixing in terms of PE curriculum? Do PE departments and teachers get comfortable if they feel it works? And is there, maybe are they less likely to look for change if they feel like that? Because you made a nod to time, right? So if time is really valuable and we don't have much of it, we have to make decisions as to what we do. And if we feel comfortable or happy with our provision in physical education, we're less likely to look for change. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, from a personal side of things, if we take it from, a normal life context, if you're cutting your grass and you've got a lawnmower that works, why would you go and buy another one? You just wouldn't, But when we're talking about the change is between education, we're talking about things are moving so rapidly. The responsibilities for PE teachers has evolved. The dynamics of students and what we know about supporting them in terms of well-being physically and mentally is evolving. We're in a context where, actually, if we took away the sort of personal protective side of actually what we do and shared a little bit more, perhaps our educational offering would be, superior. And this is, time is a huge thing within schools. There's always something to do. If I go off and teach a lesson, I could come back and find 40 emails. That is the sort of the environment that we work in. But that shouldn't also be an excuse to stop. And if you're adding value by reading books and, look at those sort of, I love those sort of white psychological covered books that you find in the bookstores where there's always a message, they're always deep thinking, but they're also the type of books that you can read on holiday and you want to share, oh my God, look at this page on this book or a podcast. Those are the type of things that actually we can do as PE teachers, where we're not eating time, we're being efficient with time.
Yeah.
But again, question that, in my department meetings, the first thing is always about sharing best practice. First 10 minutes is sharing best practice. We rotate that round and we talk about something that's added value to, a PE teacher's responsibility or workplace. This isn't exclusively, I've done this activity in PE. This is, I've seen something, I've heard something, I've watched something, and I think you should too. And I think that's where we get that time back, where we're sharing, real value. But, again, student voice, maximize parent voice.
Mm-hmm. I think I was playing a bit of devil's advocate with that question because I think my stance in terms of attitudes that I feel we should adopt as PE teachers and as teachers in general, if I'm honest. Going back to your ECT then, how did that ECT respond when you asked maybe a more profound question in terms of, a lot of some, conversations that I see between mentors and trainees are quite granular, maybe about specific aspects of teaching, for example. A question that is like, well, how does your offer differ is maybe more on a different level, maybe broader. How did they respond to that question? What are the type of answers you're getting from an ECT when you pose questions like that?
Yeah, and I think this for me becomes the question. This is the question that is our thought process that drives every sort of our weekly meetings. This is not one where necessarily that I demand an answer for, but it leads the focus of that. just to stress again, this is not, I'm asking, what are you doing that, perhaps I'm not doing in a unit of work or a concept that we're sort of trying to get in. It's about what are you doing differently to add value that actually I probably should consider as well. And when we're talking about an ECT, is they are probably looking at things completely different to how I do. I guess I'm becoming part of this, not necessarily old guard, but very, I know what a good PE lesson looks like. And I know what a good PE lesson feels like. Those are the type of statements that are actually wrong, I think, in order to sort of suggest. And, for my ECT, again, this is about a chance to have reflection. Has it been a good week or a bad week? That offer is not always a positive response. Actually, I've got this wrong. But the lessons that we can take from that every week are growing lessons, are, another layer to what we want to collectively achieve as a physical educator. I make no bones about, telling my ECT, I would love for you to be head of PE in 2-3 years' time. I think that's a really important message, because it's a message for me that states my intentions for that individual and that sort of educational value that actually, if you go out and think about what we're doing, you will be this, if that's what you want.
Yeah.
So I guess a rhetorical question, a question that's perhaps more open than closed each week, that adds meaning to our meetings and a thought process.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot, Tom, if I'm honest. I think what it does is it allows for different perspective, right? Because our knowledge and experience affects the way we perceive things. So you were saying, you mentioned years of experience and lots of, leadership and examples of teaching good lessons and what you believe is a good lesson. It takes nothing away from the perspective of the trainee and their opinions of what they're seeing and how they value things. And those two things together could be really powerful if used effectively. When there's that power imbalance, or, like an imbalanced dynamic between the expert and the novice, that's when like relationships tend to break down. It can affect the confidence of a trainee, for example. So like collaboration between the two using different perspectives is what can be really powerful. And I think if you're encouraging that young trainee to, think like a head of physical education whilst they're in their sort of forming years still, I think that's a really sort of, nice motivational sort of environment you're creating for that trainee to learn, or that ECT to learn. So there's a lot for me to think about there, Tom. I'd like to maybe share some of that style of questioning with our mentors that are out in schools. So if you could kind of provide an ECT, a PE teacher, maybe your teachers, some key, like some golden tips to improve their performance, or to improve their practice, or to improve their daily lives, what would they be?
I guess the question impact, and I appreciate this is not a revolutionary concept, and perhaps I just make reference to that moment in the podcast where you pause it and go, wow, this is what I think. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a deeper thinking process to achieve this idea. I've in recent years suddenly become obsessed with this sort of marginal gains approach to success and thinking, as a Liverpool fan, I hate to say it on this podcast, you probably just lost a lot of viewers there, but how Jurgen Klopp has suddenly become culturally an expert in terms of getting people on board, and I'm convinced in 20 years' time you look at him as a manager, if you don't already, and think what he achieved and the steps he took at those little fine margins. So I guess my sort of takeaways, if you like, are how can your students leave your lesson and have a thirst to come back for more? Can you leave such an impactful moment that it stays with them for a lifetime? Like some of my experiences. Can you influence or play a part in their life that goes beyond simply school and educational profile. You know, and you know, if you think about that sort of Ian Wright clip where he meets his primary school teacher and he breaks down, you know, it is the fundamental difference you can make in someone's life by just investing in their time. And you know, I guess you know, just to, you know, again, to go back, you know, don't just accept the norms of what's happening. You know, seek meaning in what you do and evidence and rationale that in your setting, and ultimately remove the ego. Appreciate the work that's done before, move it on, even just one step, and then allow the process to evolve.
Brilliant. Tommy, thank you so much. Lots of key points in there. Always really appreciate having a conversation with you and sharing your perspective. I appreciate you taking the time and your busy schedule to jump on and have a chat with me.
Well, Nathan, you've turned back into a robot again, so I'm not sure if you need another cup of coffee or or better IT skills. But it's been a pleasure to chat with you, Nathan. And you know, like I said, we'll touch base, I'm sure, again pretty soon, whether that be on social media arguments or in perhaps even in your context too.
Yeah, like I said previously, it'd be great to have you come down and speak to some of our trainees here at the university. But thank you very much, listeners. Hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Hope you had a pen and paper with you. Tommy made some really good points, so lots to take away. And we'll speak to you all soon.